Professor Larry Diamond, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. As a signatory of the recent international declaration warning that the threat of fascism is back, how would you characterize the most empirically robust indicators of this reemergence? To what extent do contemporary manifestations differ from classical fascism in terms of institutional form and sociopolitical function?
Well, I thought it was a very good statement. I had reservations about it because I think that the term fascism is used too casually. It's a very specific historical phenomenon, which involves elements of course, extreme authoritarianism and deprivation of civil liberties and contradiction of the rule of law, individual rights, and the very principle of individuality. And there are certainly a number of regimes around the world that manifest those characteristics or have been moving in that direction. But fascism also is ultra-nationalistic and typically quite aggressive and expansionistic, and celebrates violence as a means of acquiring and maintaining rule and of political domination, including the violence of extreme shock troops, irregular forces that do the bidding and the celebration and elevation of the leader and the intimidation of anyone who would challenge the leader. And fascist regimes freely use violence or the threat of violence to suppress and silence the opposition, and threaten to use violence against their neighbors and others as well. So I think that there is no pure form of fascism in the world today that is entirely similar to what we saw in Germany or Italy in the 1930s. But there are a number of regimes that have fascistic elements or properties. Certainly Vladimir Putin's in Russia, and there are others in Turkey, in India, and now certain features of what Donald Trump has been trying to construct in the United States in terms of the intimidation of opposition and the threats to opposition and the invitation to violence and the celebration of violence on the part of his followers that have fascistic properties. I think it's better to talk about fascistic properties or features rather than fascism per se, because I don't think we have the fully formed classic version of it in many places today. But there's a lot of fascistic behavior, organization, and intent that's spreading around the world today.
Right. The declaration identifies a resurgence of manufactured traditional authority rooted in religious, gender, and national identity constructs. How do you see these cultural logics being instrumentalized within modern illiberal or authoritarian populist regimes to reshape the boundaries of political legitimacy and citizenship?
Well, you certainly see a kind of resurrection and celebration of extreme masculinity and of very traditional, even martial or militaristic notions of what constitutes male identity and the male role, and the effort to subjugate women uh, and to draw artificially rigid boundaries around sexual identity and sexual behavior, and just put people into, rigid state-sponsored, movement-sponsored boxes. These are also elements of an extreme authoritarian or in some ways fascistic mentality. You see this in China too, although, it's kind of odd to call a communist regime fascistic, but they share certain properties in terms of hierarchy, domination, chauvinism, militarism, uh, and aggressive threats to their neighbors. So I find it more useful personally, and I think we're drifting in that direction in the world, and the phenomenon with its many component parts seems to be more relevant in the world these days. But I find it more useful to break it apart into its pieces and analyze where these pieces are emerging or gaining momentum, and what it means for the character and dynamics internally and internationally of authoritarian behavior.
Right. In your analysis of democratic regression, you emphasize the process of incremental strangulation of liberal institutions by elected executives. How does this slow erosion align with the historical trajectory of fascism? Would you consider today's authoritarianism to be a technocratic mutation of the fascist archetype, less overtly violent but no less repressive?
Well, it certainly is in most places less repressive than the classic instances of fascism, particularly in Nazi Germany. But some of them have been, kind of creeping in that direction. It didn't take long between the time that Hitler entered power in early 1933 to the time, really months later, that he had eliminated opposition and begun to throw his opponents in jail, and before too much longer in emergent concentration camps. I would not describe the collapse of the liberal and constitutional state in Germany after Hitler's rise to the chancellorship as an incremental process. It happened in stages, but they came very rapidly and very brutally. Italy, a little bit more incrementally, but not in the same way as we've seen under Orbán in Hungary, under Recep Tayyip Erdoğan in Turkey, under Narendra Modi in India, which remains sufficiently incremental so that people still debate whether we can call India an electoral democracy. I tend to think it's crossed the line into authoritarianism. It took a while in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. It didn't take very long, this most recent time in power of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. Happened pretty quickly under Bukele in El Salvador. So it varies, but in the classic instance of a country that has been a democracy for some time, whether a liberal democracy or not, it usually is an incremental process that may move step by step over a period of years to demonize the opposition, undermine the independence of the legislature and certainly the judiciary, which must be quashed if authoritarian regimes are to have kind of free reign to emerge, and the ultimate elimination of all independent sources of power, regulatory institutions in the executive branch, civil society, the professional civil service, the business community, the mass media, and so on. Usually, it takes a few years and sometimes a number of years for an emerging autocrat to sufficiently conquer and crush these independent institutions in government and civil society so that they can have unchecked power. And even when they've crossed the line into authoritarianism, which I think Erdoğan did, within some number of years after taking power around 2003, more than 2 or 3 perhaps, but considerably less than 10. Even after the line had been crossed from electoral democracy into electoral or competitive authoritarianism, the incremental descent can proceed and the regime can become more authoritarian, more abusive, more terroristic, more domineering, more hegemonic, and, to use a word that is increasingly in vogue, with more and more frequent manifestations of fascism.
Right. The declaration posits a growing epistemic crisis, an erosion of truth, science, and critical inquiry. Are we witnessing a systemic undermining of epistemic authority as a strategy of soft authoritarianism? And how does this epistemic degradation relate to the collapse of public trust and the spread of disinformation?
Well, I think the causation moves in both directions because it's a collapse of trust in all kinds of institution and sources of information that helps to pave the way for authoritarian populism to come into power and elevate a leader, a great leader, as the source of all wisdom and authority, to try and rescue the country from various forms of treason, greed, sabotage, corruption, however they depict the ruling elite, the ruling establishment. And then, of course, once in power, these kinds of leaders and parties further accentuate public distrust in science, in objective sources of knowledge, in alternative sources of information, in anything we know to be true, independent of what the dear leader and the ruling party say is true. So I think what you describe as an epistemic crisis typically precedes, to some degree, the coming to power of a authoritarian, hegemonic, extremely illiberal, populist political party with deeply authoritarian, if not fascistic, intentions and ambitions, and then they drive the people further into distrust and cynicism, and into a mode of thinking and reasoning that puts blind faith in a single leader and party.
Right. The declaration calls for renewed multilateralism grounded in human rights and the rule of law. With international institutions facing legitimacy crisis, what new or reformed global mechanisms might be necessary to counteract the diffusion of authoritarian norms and sharp power influence?
Well, there are many dimensions of crisis that we're facing in the world for the rule of law and the liberal international order. And obviously, they've gotten worse with the multiple conflicts in the Middle East over the last, 2.5 years, if not more. I worry deeply about this, about the damage that's been done to the United Nations and the trashing of other institutions of the liberal international order from all directions, the direction of Russia and China, the direction of Iran, and the direction of Trump in the United States with his attempt for multilateral institutions in general, and the entire liberal international order that, after all, has kept the peace in Europe for 80 years until Vladimir Putin broke it, and I think remains our best hope for international peace and security and individual freedom. I think that the international multilateral institutions are really hurting. The United Nations has looked quite feeble in the recent crisis in the Middle East. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, all of these are under terrific pressure. The whole nuclear non-proliferation order, which I think did a relatively poor job of restraining Iran from seeking to become a nuclear weapon state, the same could be said for it. So, to my mind, we need to start with the democracies of the world and try and build out from there a commitment to rule of law, international order, and collective security. And that has to mean reassertion of mechanisms of peace and security in the Middle East. It has to mean a clear message to the People's Republic of China that the so-called international community opposes any use of force to resolve the conflict over Taiwan, competing visions of what sovereignty should be across the strait. And certainly it means that Vladimir Putin cannot be allowed to compel the dissolution of Ukraine into a greater imperial Russia by force. So a stronger NATO, a stronger alliance of liberal democracies, stronger commitment to international order and the integrity of borders, and a shared commitment to collective defense. These are some of the things that I think would be building blocks for trying to reconstitute things. But we can't start reassembling those building blocks while we're withdrawing, we, the United States, from the liberal international order. So, to my mind, not only do we need to work closely with our NATO allies, other EU allies, Japan, Korea, Australia, and so on, India to the extent it will cooperate. We need to rejuvenate, reconstruct, relaunch our instruments of international engagement in the United States, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the Voice of America, other instruments of aid and support, scholarships and engagement for people around the world to come to our universities for our scientific and technological and medical innovations to be shared with the world, and so on and so forth.
All right. In the electoral reform imperative, you diagnose effective polarization as a destabilizing force for democratic governance. How the populist actors exploit this emotional antagonism to reframe pluralism as moral corruption and consolidate plebiscitary rule under the guise of majoritarianism.
Yeah, thank you. Well, they do it pretty much by the way your question describes. It's very important to understand that people who want to crush democracy and who seek to do so by politics, by winning power through competitive elections, they need to create an atmosphere of fear and desperation. In other words, they need to polarize politics in order to conquer power. And all of the agents of illiberal or authoritarian populism, I repeat, Orbán, Erdoğan, Robert Fico in Slovakia, certainly Modi in India, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador when he was in power for 6 years as president of Mexico, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela during his era and now his successor, Nicolas Maduro. They all polarize politics. They have to create an atmosphere of fear and hatred for the other side because rational politics, deliberation, compromise, these things are, and reason, these things are the enemy of the project of conquering and entrenching total power that these political leaders are seeking. And so they create fear, they create animosity, they create hatred, they employ memes and narratives that divide people in a very emotional way and that manipulate symbols of fear, of violence, of militarism, and extreme ambition to set people off against one another and to identify some dangerous other in the country. That typically it's a minority group or an outsider. It could be immigrants. It could be a minority group like the Roma in Central and Eastern Europe. It could be a religious minority of some kind, but they need somebody to beat up on and get people to fear.
Right. Your collaborative work on America in One Room suggests that structured deliberation can depolarize attitudes and restore democratic norms. How scalable are these models of deliberative democracy in politically fragile or culturally heterogeneous societies, especially where civic trust is already eroded?
Well, we think that the methods are scalable. The problem with scalability is not that you can't get people with very different political orientations or very different racial or religious backgrounds in one room. When you get out of the white hot glare of politics and mass media polarization, and just invite people to come and deliberate, share their views, hear others' views, often you can persuade people to do it. The problem is that getting them to do it in person is very expensive. You know, you've got to fly them somewhere, or you need human beings to manage in-person gatherings. You need to employ or hire moderators to moderate the different small group sessions. Now that we have in our deliberative democracy lab at Stanford University an online platform very similar to the one we're using now to record this interview, but one that can handle, as Zoom can handle, 10, 15, 20 people or more. If it can handle 12 people, that's enough. But this platform, which uses a kind of simple piece of artificial intelligence, manages everyone on a screen, puts the questions to them, makes sure that everybody can speak, that everybody is speaking respectfully to one another, that everyone gets a turn to speak. And so it's a very flexible, clever, fair, and intuitively friendly piece of software that I think has generated dramatic new possibilities to scale up deliberation if you've got the right questions and the right framework for assembling people.
Right. Given the weaponization of electoral legitimacy by populist incumbents to hollow out liberal checks and balances, do you view institutional reforms such as proportional representation or open primaries as viable defenses against democratic backsliding, or might they risk unintended consequences?
Well, it's a good question. When you start tinkering with institutions, and certainly this includes electoral systems, you do risk unintended consequences. And I think this should counsel some degree of humility on the part of institutional reformers. But in the case of countries like India, the US, and the United Kingdom that have simple majoritarian forms of first past the post, in an era of political polarization, I think having people just choose only one candidate over another and having a winner emerge who may only have 35, 38% of the vote, as has happened now in Britain with the Labour Party, it's not very democratic. And it increases cynicism in politics to have total power given to someone who is barely the preference of a third of the electorate. And keep in mind what can happen maybe in a moderate direction in one election with a moderate Labour prime minister coming to power in Britain could happen 4 or 5 years later with a more extreme party winning an absolute majority of seats because of the bonus seats that a party may obtain in first past the post. And it is in a context, a social context, a psychological context of polarization of the kind that is being generated by rising economic inequality in the world and by social media in the world. You don't want a political system, an electoral system, heightening that polarization further. So I favor, at a minimum, moving to the Australian system of the preferential vote, or what we call in the US ranked choice voting. Another option is proportional representation. But if we move to proportional representation, which would be very hard for the US to do, but if a country does, I think they're better off using a moderate version of it that doesn't result in too much party fragmentation, and that creates more open list type of politics so that parties are not so completely in control of who within their party gets elected. If a country is struggling with polarization, the Irish system of the single transferable vote is a good system to look at.
All right. And lastly, Professor Diamond, to what extent does the co-optation of far-right discourse by centrist parties accelerate the normalization of authoritarian populism? Is this a short-term electoral tactic or a structural accommodation with long-term implications for the ideological boundaries of democratic politics?
Well, it's another good question. And since these projects have really been gaining momentum in the last 15 years or so, it's really too soon to answer that question. And even sooner in terms of right of center parties trying to co-opt some of the voters of the extreme right and co-opt some of the agenda. I will say this, on the one hand, right of center parties and even progressive parties, there was a very intelligent commentary by a progressive British analyst in the New York Times recently, arguing that progressive parties would be wise to get serious about managing immigration in a more robust way, because you need a kind of unified sense of the nation to generate the commitment to help those less fortunate, the poor, the marginalized, and so on. And it's harder to muster that if people feel that a lot of the benefits are kind of, by their telling, leaking out to support people who've only just arrived and are not really part of the national project. I think that Europe, the United States, other advanced industrial democracies need humane and generous policies of immigration. And for one thing, they need the labor, right? Because with declining populations or declining growth rates, they're going to be facing labor shortages of some kinds. But they have to be serious about preserving the integrity of borders. If you don't have borders, you don't really have a country. And so, on the one hand, I think it is right and proper for other political parties, not only of the right, but of the center left, to look at the frustrations with unchecked immigration that the far right, the populist right, tinged with fascistic overtones, has been fanning as protest, and figure out a way to address it and engage it and so on. But that doesn't mean you adopt the racism, the hatred, the xenophobia of the far right. And so, you know, being humane, being decent, being respectful and caring of the human dignity of other people wherever they have come from, I think is a very important element here. But that doesn't have to mean, and I don't think it is sustainable for a liberal democracy to have it mean purely open borders. That's just one example where I think there's a few specific policies that more mainstream or progressive parties can respond to, some of the issues that the far right has been responding to, and the far right is raising concern about economic inequality, economic injustice, and certainly those are progressive issues that democratic parties need to address. So I think this really has to be answered on an issue by issue basis.
Professor Larry Diamond, thank you so very much for your time. Very much appreciated.
Okay, thank you. Nice talk.